At the end of this month, about 3,500 people could be jobless if ArcelorMittal South Africa stops steel production at its operations in Newcastle and Vereeniging. The National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa is urging government to come up with solutions to stop the closures. Irvin Jim is Numsa General Secretary and joins me now. Mr. Jim, a very good afternoon to you. Thanks very much for your time. Perhaps I just felt maybe it's important to put this out there as a bit by way of context, that ArcelorMittal South Africa was in fact born out of the privatization of ISCO, which was a state-owned enterprise, which is a state-owned company. We were told at the time that the private sector would do an even better job than what ISCO was doing as a state-owned entity.
Well, good afternoon, viewer, and good afternoon to listeners. I think as a union, we would have insisted that all countries that have done perfectly well in driving manufacturing and industrialization are countries where the state have played a very critical role, a state that intervene, a state that guide and drive development. Van der Bay, who created ISCO, who created Eskom, was very deliberate for the Afrikaner folk in the history of this country. When he decided to create those critical institutions such as Eskom to provide a competitive electricity tariff, to ensure that such an asset, such as a steel company in the form of ISCO then, which is ArcelorMittal today, was set up, and it was critical that both for upstream and downstream, we must have this kind of an asset to drive manufacturing and industrialization. You would remember that there was an agreement between ArcelorMittal, which was ISCO then, and Kumba Iron Steel. I think it was cost plus 3 agreement kind of an arrangement, with government playing a leading role. It meant that the iron ore input cost and everything else, there was no import parity pricing at the time. It meant that it was critical for driving manufacturing, industrialization, both in upstream, where ArcelorMittal is, and in the downstream industries. We now have to face this reality that as we speak, ArcelorMittal have been, before 2023 come to an end, would have highlighted a subdued, weak economy. And we know why, that the state has not been moving in terms of an expansionary budget and driving building of infrastructure so that this asset can be able to asset supply and create jobs. And secondly, they raise the issue of transport cost, energy cost. And we know that the environment that they've been complaining about is made worse by mini mills that are not necessarily regulated, who make steel available cheap to competitors of ArcelorMittal. And they were complaining about 40% of steel that is, they are given discount for about 40%. And they don't use scrap in terms of their own mills. They use iron ore. And therefore, they find an environment which is completely uncompetitive for themselves, and they think that other competitors to themselves are given a competitive edge. Our position will have been that the government must create a platform and bring all social partners in the table to iron out all of these issues, so that we do not lose the strategic asset and capability for manufacturing and industrialization. I think in the statement we issued, we spell this as a disaster that is waiting to happen, and it will worsen the industrialization that is taking place in our country.
Not only that, 3,500 jobs to be lost is way too much. I don't think we can afford that as a country, given where things are. Now, from what we've been told, ArcelorMittal has been in talks with the Department of Trade and Industry since December 2023. Everyone's reluctant to talk about that. From what you know, has there been any movement or at least indications that they are being listened to?
Well, our position, we can't have government tiptoeing in the shadows. It must come out, it must explain, because clearly this decision is a clear indication of failed collapse engagement, not only with DTIC, but with the presidency. We are aware that President Cyril Ramaphosa has been engaged by ArcelorMittal, DTIC has been engaged, and clearly what this symbolizes is that there's a deadlock in terms of those negotiations. We now can't bear the brunt of having just to deal with Section 189, as you say, have off such a huge capability. As you would know that one person who's got a job support 5 to 6 extended families. And therefore, this is a catastrophe we cannot be able to accept. We think that government must come on board. I have reached out to the Minister of Trade and Industry this morning, who is receiving a briefing from his staff, and he has promised that he will come back to us to say what must we do and what form of an engagement we should be participating on.
Well, I mean, if, as the CEO of ArcelorMittal said at a briefing, that government is not willing but is not able to take the decisions, then what hope do you have that your advance this morning will yield or stands a better chance?
Well, we have no choice. We going to have to go to Section 189 consultation process. Such a process has to do with getting the details from the company, and we will have to have a meeting with government, and we would have to drag them into the table, and these are the jobs of workers. And therefore, we expect a responsive government. We have no reason to believe that they are not going to come and engage.
Now, outside of the issues that you yourself, mentioned, like cheap steel imports from China, but also other factors that you mentioned earlier, ArcelorMittal also talks about the reality of their industry currently, owing to weak domestic and global economy.
There's a big crisis of steel that is being dumped from Asia. And one of the things they are picking up against such a challenge is the question of export tax. Ourselves as a union, for some time, we would have campaigned that we must ban exportation of scrap metal so that scrap can be made available locally to create jobs, because scrap is very critical in terms of conversion cost. It's easy to turn it around and it's good for creating jobs. You would know that we used to have close to 35 foundries that have closed, and many jobs were lost in that particular process. One of the key issues that ArcelorMittal is putting on the table, which makes them to be uncompetitive and is no longer relevant in their view, but it helped their competitors, is the whole question of export tax, which was put there to ensure that scrap is made available locally and so forth. And they strongly feel that that must be reviewed. And our view is that if they are allowed to close this plant, this will not just affect the steel industry in terms of downstream. The auto sector will be negatively affected. The component value chain will be negatively affected, because it is those works of ArcelorMittal that are delivering specialized steel that can be used in cars in terms of component value chain.
Of course, there are, in addition to, domestic and global economy weaknesses, there's also the question, the Eskom blackouts issue has at least been resolved, but there's still the dysfunction of Transnet's rail network, which is another problem. In other words, even if they were to deal with or solve these other problems, there are other issues that are also in the purview of the state. Presumably, that's the reason you're saying everyone should sit around the table and deal and thresh out all these issues.
We're calling for an engagement with the economic cluster of government. We know now that there's no longer a Department of Public Enterprise. It has been thrown into the presidency, and we're of the view that we must engage, for instance, with ESCOM. All the bottlenecks around Transnet must be engaged. Obviously, we want to hear what is the difference because, as you would know, there are smelters that would have been given a package of tariffs that are progressive to keep those jobs. But for a company like ArcelorMittal, they would have bargained for particular tariff levels to ensure that they are kept afloat, they are economically viable. And we cannot afford a situation where we lose electricity tariff that is competitive, that ensures that both in upstream and downstream, we're able to be competitive as a country. And I mean, we experienced this in the auto industry. If you take companies like Ford, they are leading in the market in terms of delivering cars, but there is a big debate in the transition from combustion engine to electric vehicles, that which countries are going to be allocated production, because you competing in one company with Thailand and so forth. Other countries, in terms of input cost, they reduce those input costs so that they become a relevant destination for investment. All those issues would have to be put on the table, both for ArcelorMittal and the entire manufacturing sector across various sectors in terms of backward and forward linkages.
Irvin Jim, let me thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. He's the General Secretary of the National Union of Metalworkers of South Africa, on the back, of course, of the news that 3,500 jobs could be culled if ArcelorMittal South Africa stops steel production at the end of this month in Newcastle and Vereeniging.